Michelle.
Daniel, OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again to one in honor of the upcoming Parallax course that we have starting July 7th on a Sunday. We're looking forward to that. We really enjoyed the last class we did, Look to the Birds of the Air. You can still find that on Parallax. And we've already had a wonderful discussion with Cadell and Alex Ebert, 2 discussions on Parallax about the course, and we just thought we'd talk again today, a bit inspired by a conversation we had at Philosophy Portal, where Ebert was presenting on metapolitics and was quite fascinating. Greg Denber was there, and he does a lot of metamodernism, so we were thinking about his work as well. He's got a book coming out called On Metamodernism, highly suggested. He's always fascinating. And we talked about a number of things, kind of Ebert was presenting on neurological differences between, say, conservatives and liberals, generally based on like Jonathan Haidt's work, I think, and kind of also if there are neurological differences that lead to different political dispositions, how that might kind of open up freedom to interact with the other, because you can sort of see them as speaking from just kind of a different determination, to use a Hegelian term, a different starting point, which may kind of release us from some hesitancies to speak with the other. But the details of that point are stuff we get in at the class, that we got into at the discussion, and you can find that at Philosophy Portal, and it's just a wonderful gathering that we have over there with Cadell that we're grateful for. But one of the things that Cadell mentioned that was kind of fascinating is what exactly this kind of question to reflect on politics in a meta sense, kind of meta reflecting back on it. What is it that neither side in politics, we'll just speak conservative and liberal in an American context here, what is it exactly that neither are talking about, that by not talking about, or that they're kind of avoiding, is leading to these pathologies that are so problematic? What is missing? And, we mentioned a bit of how everyone, kind of assumes a value form of understanding things according to the commodity structure, kind of the equal sign that we discussed at Theory Underground on Marx and Capital. But there's another way, and this gets a bit into what Cadell and I talked about at Parallax, is how I think there's not a lot of talk on what it would look like to take seriously the individual in a way that's not a particularist project, but that has universal ramifications. Like, how can we think about the subject in a manner that actually will help us interact universally, not just form different metaphysics and ontological schemas that are just going to make a particularist community? Because I think that's a real danger here, of just doing philosophy to form different particularist projects. In Matthew Stanley, his tremendous book on ideology and Christian freedom, was talking about how in the novel Silence by Endo, how Father Rodriguez ultimately retreats to a kind of private faith to think about his Christianity. He steps on the Fumi, he apostrophates Jesus, but it's okay, because in his heart he still has a private faith, and so there's this kind of idea that he's still a Christian even if he carries out this activity. And Matthew Stanley pointed out that this might not be so different from the Western Buddhism that Zizek warns about, which is a kind of ego death, a death of the subject, where you have a certain inner serenity, but then you have no political relevance, because, you're not acting in the world because you have an inner peace. And what Stanley was warning is that a private religious faith, that you silently live your days in Japan, secretly as a Christian maybe, with a private faith, could be very similar to that Buddhism that Zizek is talking about, that make you politically irrelevant or socially irrelevant, or not really participating in a larger political discourse. And I think we can basically say that if we use philosophy or metaphysics to form particularist projects, that's similar to private faiths, where you're just withdrawing into your individual communities and your ways of seeing things. And then the capital nation state, as Karatani talks about, and we talk about it in Belonging Again 2.1, will then not be changed. And if there's something about that is heading toward a great stagnation in a Keynes sense, or toward the Nick Land AI taking over, or if there's going to be global tensions in a Dugan sense that lead to massive ramifications, well, withdrawing into particularist projects, like withdrawing into private faiths, is not going to be adequate. And in fact, that's going to be surrendering and giving up an address of the problem of pluralism, because you're basically saying, well, it can't be addressed, so let's just withdraw to our particularist communities and put up the walls. And of course, no one's going to say it's walls that they're putting up, but that's practically what it's going to be if we can't learn to interact with the other. But of course, this poses a big, question, which is an obsession of belonging again, of what would it mean, though, then to face global pluralism that is not just withdrawing into particularist projects. It's actually going to be open to the other, not just kind of talking about the other. And I think that has massive economic ramifications, political ramifications, and things like that. So it's, and again, these are major concerns of belonging again.
Yeah, no, that's all really, really good, Daniel. And I am, we're really looking forward to the Parallax class, and the talk was great at Philosophy Portal with Alex Siebert and at in the event space, and for Real Talk. Sorry, did I say that?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's something that was coming to mind as you were speaking, was just generally how, it's so interesting today how politics feels so big, it feels so kind of up there somewhere, or like maybe the fact that we have a globalized world, really. I mean, it now we can know about all sorts of types of governments, and you've never met the president, obviously. Like, there's just these things where it feels so distant, and yet it has such real. I mean, I guess you realize that more as an adult, I think, more than when you're a kid, how much it can impact your daily life, or things you're able to do or not do, things like that. Just do lawmaking and stuff like that, But honestly, a lot of the lawmaking that's going to impact you the most will be at your local level.
Sure.
But there are things that are impacted by the national decisions or the national level. And I guess it kind of makes this strange relationship to politics then, because it's sort of this partly ambivalent, but partly concerned, but partly apathetic.
Yeah.
And so I think that it can, maybe in that way, it speaks to kind of what Cadell was saying, where he talks about how Hegel talks so little about voting.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, and how he said, like, on a practical level, he kind of lives that way, or has lived that way, where it's just like kind of not really believing it matters too much. And yet we kind of get these slogans and mantras about, like, every vote matters, and your voice counts, your vote counts, and I think there's this oscillation, and I don't know if that's just because of our particular moment in history, where there's this oscillation between it doesn't matter, and then maybe it does a lot, because maybe there's some big orchestration, and I could kind of shift the fate of humanity by a political tally or whatever, or impact, just by a vote, right? And so it's sort of this, like, strange place of also not realizing how much it might matter until it's, like, not too late, but until you realize, oh, I guess there are people there who care and try and maybe push for certain things that then allow you to do X, Y, or Z, right? That maybe had they not, it wouldn't be there. And so I think it's just, I don't know if that people have actually always felt that way throughout history to a degree. Obviously, like, if we think about America and the establishment of this nation, it was sort of erected upon, hey, you guys up there are not listening.
Sure.
And you don't hear and you don't care, and you're doing these things that we don't agree with. So we're just going to leave. Yep. And we're going to make it up. We're going to make something somewhere else. And we're going to establish our own reign and our own rules, right? I mean, I guess and maybe that's just kind of the ebbs and flows of history, and then the necessity of kind of like creative destruction, like we talk about for as it relates to the market, capitalism, etc. But there's this sort of interesting thing of, like, again, I don't know why, but in my mind I just keep thinking about it in terms of this oscillation between apathy and yet genuine concern about what it might mean for your life, and then kind of maybe being kind of feeling a little stuck in the middle where you don't know if it really matters or not, but you sort of maybe just hope that by going through the motions or doing the thing, voting, for example, that it will matter or make a difference. But then you also find yourself in difficult positions where it's like, yes, you get to vote, but it's like being forced to choose between like two of your worst ice cream flavors or something like that. Like, yeah, you got to choose, but you really don't, like, you know what I'm saying? It's not like there's something strange and inhibiting, but also necessarily inhibiting, I suppose, about the structure that exists. But anyways, I really just want to say that I think that's why it's a tricky topic to talk about, because we don't always, like, politics seems so strangely far away, and yet it can impact if you have a recycling center in your town, you know?
Yes.
So it's just odd like that. And I don't know if it's always felt that way or if it's just now because things are much bigger, and there's like, this is also why, my last thing will be this, but this concept of too big to fail, where, you know, you get companies in bed with the government and then things just get huge, and maybe that's for good and for bad. But yeah, it's a odd thing to sort of talk about, and I think that's why something I brought up in the real talk today is sort of trying to get back to thinking about it on the politic in the general sense, right? Like in the Greek sense of that word, where you're part of the corpus of society. So yes, maybe you can and cannot impact certain things, but you can do certain things in your own particularity that may have some, even if it seems microscopic, but still an impact on the larger society. So anyways, that was
I think that's very well worded. It makes me think of Denver's notion of the oscillation, where metamodernism and the aesthetic, where you're moving from this irony to this sincerity. And I think the key in some of the examples Denver had, where there's this kind of unstableness, where the artists that in the act of irony, they're so ironic that they must be sincere, or they're so sincere that they must be ironic.
Right.
Likewise, there's this kind of oscillation with politics where it really matters and it doesn't matter, and in that feeling that it doesn't matter, then there's this moment of, well, they must really think it matters if they keep telling themselves it doesn't matter. It's like they're trying to live with the fact that it matters and they can't do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
But then you have this idea that if you overemphasize how much it matters, it's like, oh, well, their ego is just idea. They want it to matter so that they have power and importance, right? So there's this interesting... That ambiguity you're describing, that kind of weirdness, I think is a kind of meta-modern texture, if you will, like Denver describes. And yeah, it's very interesting because in this, on the one hand, when you listen to people talk about politics, they're like, our vote doesn't matter. But the other thing that's completely nuts is if you listen to some, like if you go through the documentary or read the books on K Street or the politicians are like, yeah, we can't do anything because of people. Like, the people will vote us out of office. It's this weird thing where on one hand, people are like, it doesn't matter what we do. But then the politicians are like, yeah, we can't do anything because of the people. Like, the people...
And they're just, like, groveling for votes. So it's like, please, like, can you please, like, you know...
Yeah, it's this really weird thing where the politicians are like, yeah, we'd like to, but, you know, we don't have any power because the people have all the power. And then the people are like, yeah, we'd like to, but the government has all the power.
And the lobbyists all have all the power.
Yeah, it's this very weird thing. And this is where... Yeah, it does seem like the lobbyists are very powerful in the Jonathan Rout's, that incredible book, Government's End. And I think about Marcise Olson's book, The Rise and Fall of Nations. I do think is very important here on this idea that politics becomes very Oscarified by special interest groups. And I guess you could also talk about Buchanan's managerial class. And so there's a way also in which... maybe the feeling of the disempowered by politicians, because it seems like politicians feel disempowered. Maybe everyone's disempowered by the special interest groups. And really what needs to be focused on is reforming special interest groups. Well, I mean, that's what that's a legal thing. And I think the special interest groups are very problematic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's where, just to say on what I said before about like business and government together. That's where you seem to have the most, yes, potential good, but also potential harm. I mean... Yeah, I think I feel like I really, you know, saw a totally different perspective and deeper inside understanding of like legislation and how voting works and how particular, like when you're voting on a particular law or bill or whatever, because like, especially during 2020, and I just, you know, for whatever reason, I just kind of got a little bit more interested in that and like looked more into that and even called people, you know, and called senators, called Congress people, and I was like, wow, there's a lot. And I'd like watch those hearings. Like my brother used to watch C-SPAN.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my gosh. And that was like that. I don't know, to me as a, preteen, I thought that was like the most boring thing in the world.
Yeah.
Like, why would you watch that? But, I understand that he was kind of trying to learn about the actual system and like how do these things actually happen. And a lot of it is kind of a lot of like, I don't want to say boring, but what's so crazy is like these kind of extended meetings that feel, I don't know how to put this, but it's like,
there's a weird impotence to it, a weakness. I always am struck by how weak the government
it feels
seems.
so weak in the actual occurrence of it, but I'm like, oh my gosh, because what would happen is I'd be like, vetting for a certain vote or a certain decision, and then it wouldn't go through, even though you had these very compelling cases. Like the most emotive and compelling and interesting parts were like when people would give their testimonies or their stories, or they'd be really kind of, and then you just get these people being like, okay, but you're basically a minority, whatever it is, like, and whatever it had to do with, whether it was health stuff or school stuff. And I just thought that was really interesting that at the end of the day, they just basically made it like in this sort of, again, it's like you're talking about this sort of not crazy power dynamic. It's just kind of it's something you could easily overlook, and yet it has these massive consequences that impact people's like actual lives. And I think there's something like I empathize with how like it kind of gave me more empathy, but also a little bit, I was a little disillusioned too.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was like, wow, these people are making like really compelling cases here. And these people don't even, like, they're not even like, oh, we'll look into that more.
No,
they're like, no.
Yeah.
And you're like, why did they just say no? Is that just because of the collective us? Like I was talking about in the Real Talk today, where, I was talking about how I'm reading this book about these high school students and how there's just this collective idea, grades are important. If you get bad grades, your life is over, and you're not getting to college. And some students just don't care because they don't even want that. They don't even want to engage with any of that sort of like pressure. So they just don't. They don't care. But the people who do care, these students like really get pressured by grades, even though there's not somebody saying like, if you don't do this, you won't get into college. And yet somehow just that collective us, the us of everybody, it just makes them feel that stress, that pressure. And it's like, is that what's going on with like these lawmakers? And then additionally, the lobbyist, right? It's like, well, there are certain businesses that really benefit from X decision over Y decision, and they can pay a lot of money and really in like sway decisions. And it's just like, all these sort of even behind the scenes of stuff just that happen, that then you're like, I don't know, it's like, it's great that there's at least that process, but it can feel a little bit like it could I don't know, it's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit disillusioning, but at least there is that process. But it does almost feel like this isn't a real discussion. There's a part of it that doesn't feel like a real discussion, and in that way it's kind of boring. Like if they could at least have a robust debate and kind of like, oh, that's interesting, I never thought about that, like that would be kind of like a long form discussion that would be interesting. But it's almost like, wow, that's so quick, and it really impacted, it made this really, they huge concluded something that could have real huge consequences for people. And it's just, it's wild because I'm just, so anyways, I just want to say that all that to say, there's something really eye-opening about like learning more about that process, and then realizing, I mean, you kind of come away from it like both realizing your impact and not that what your voice does matter and it doesn't matter. That's and I think you have to just live with that, like, kind of tension or dialectic, I suppose.
Well, I mean, the issue is, it's like we make our tools and our tools make us. We make our laws and then our laws make up. We make our processes and our processes make up.
Yeah.
The issue is these things that define, like, the state, they didn't appear in nature. Humans made them.
Yeah.
But then we made them and they made us, right? And one of the problems is perhaps one of the things to think politics today is we have to really take seriously that whatever we create a feedback loop with. And the thing that it's like Hegel talked about with the master-slave dialectic, the slave actually has the power because the master is dependent on. Humans make the law, and you say, oh, well, that means humans have, like, power over the law. No, the law has the power. The law does everything, so then actually humans become weak. Likewise, we create capitalism, we create markets, but then markets do everything, and there's a certain weakness that then we have in making the things. The master actually becomes weak to the slave. That's the weird thing that's at play. And if you don't realize that, well, and then the thing that you create changes your very way of experiencing the world. So you were talking about the kids at school. Like, literally the pressure they feel, like college, let's talk about college is a kind of objective fiction, to use a Zizekian, but a sociological term.
Yeah.
Like, college is something humans made that then has real causal impacts on how they live their life. And Matthew was talking about this in his book, right? And the pressure kids feel and the mental illness they develop, all of that is real. But once it's created, I mean, it didn't have to be created. It's a kind of objective fiction. It's also false that if you don't go to college, your life is over. There is now so many people who are actually better off by not going to college as blue-collar workers, mechanics. They're not in college debt. I mean, you know, it just wasn't objective.
By AI as much.
Yeah, that's right. It's a kind of objective fiction, right? Mm-hmm. But the issue is that once we make things, they become causally impactful on us. Yeah. And just because you personally say, well, I think college is stupid, well, not going still impacts you. Your publication opportunities, the people you meet, these things impact you, maybe for better, maybe for worse, but you can't not be impacted by this thing that's created. Likewise, you can say the legal process is stupid, but it still impacts you. Exactly. You know, likewise, you can say capitalism is dumb, communism is dumb, it doesn't matter. These things have causal impacts on you. And I think one of the things that we have to take seriously is I think often we go, oh, well, politics is dumb. Well, guess what? It still matters. Oh, and capitalism's dumb. It still matters. College is dumb. You know, we can't simply deal with these issues by saying they're dumb because they still impact you.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think it actually does make me think a lot about, you know, our work with Belonging Again 2.1 and this sort of place of being able to acknowledge its pitfalls and the things that it can't do and the things it does like poorly.
Yes.
But also recognize its necessity and the things it does well. And I think that is where you hold that place of being able to critique it, but also still engage it and still acknowledge that it's there, right? Yes. It is there and it has huge impacts. And you know, do you have a better alternative either? Like, have you concretely thought of a different way to do things? Yes. Because unless you've really thought about that long and hard, and then also not just thought, but been able to have some sort of like practice of it, you can only be but so like just like lambashing it. Like you could, it's fair to have critiques. It's good, we should, but it's just that I don't know. I think that's that place where you're trying to situate yourself in a way that isn't, like in a sense, I think that's what Belonging Again really is trying to evoke, encourage, and maybe demonstrate or discuss is like how to be able to have that situatedness in something you don't just take on the face value. Like you don't take it for its face value, but you also don't just ignore it and efface it. Like you live with what it is, and you learn how to both have an appreciation for it, but also a type of healthy skepticism and critique of it, but also recognizing it's there. So how if you can, how can you engage with it, or to, you know, I want to say maybe even participate, because it's because it is again, it is there. So if you can learn how to do that, that seems to be the best route.
Well, there's a weird thing, thinking of Thomas Wynn's work, where this is where the kind of idea of annihilation or nihilism or negativity are actually perhaps necessary for this, and thus going through the the quote-unquote meaning crisis was actually historically necessary. Because if you're, say, trying to interact in government and you go, well, nothing matters. Well, then it might be easier to interact with government because no matter what happens, nothing matters, right? But use it like that could be used as a kind of defense, a kind of golden thread as you go into the labyrinth to actually not let the pressure get to you. Mm-hmm. Also, too, if you're always able to say, well, nothing matters. Law is ultimately arbitrary. Okay, well, if it's arbitrary, why not use it? Or you're able to actually remove it. There's a certain nihilism in this, as the way that Wynn's talking about, based on Heidegger and other thinkers, and also Hegel. There's really this way in which the realization of the groundlessness of everything is actually the ticket, because it allows you to see that, because everything you're describing, everything we're describing is objective. Institutions are more so objective fictions than they are the buildings. Like, they're the narratives. They're the structures of organizations of the subject.
Yeah.
Like, law is more so the way it structures you in society than it is the words on the paper, right? Like, it is because it's not merely... The speed limit is not merely being seen by the police officer. It's the knowledge that there is a speed limit that will change your behavior even if you're not caught, right? Like, it's more so in the realm of not merely force but power, to make that distinction from thoughts. Where force is where I hold a gun to your head and say you must do X. Where power is where I surround you by an environment that makes you want to do X. Yeah. You internalize it. And Stanley was talking about this as well. He was saying that, force... government is weak, that requires force. Like, a government held together by fear is weak, actually.
Right.
A strong government is held together by an internalization, and I'll call that power.
Right.
And that also gets into belonging again, too, on aesthetics and the history of aesthetics being used to formulate the subject to act a certain way. Whether that be Great Transformation, Distinctions, Pierre, the history of the notion of witchcraft, I could go on. But the point is that real power is a formulation of a subject. Mm-hmm. It's not force, right? Mm-hmm. And so law, institutions, government, capital, economics, these things are actually more so matters of power than force. They are ways that structure us in the world, and how we behave without us even thinking about it. And so the question is, how do you hold that in a better way, like you were pointing at?
Yeah.
Well, realizing they're objective fictions is both the thing that could help us be more creative with them and risk making them arbitrary. And make them feel empty and dumb. Well, but actually, maybe we could interact with them more creatively or more in a liberated way.
Yeah, no, that was all really good. And I think that's great you bring in the annihilating from Thomas Wynne and Heidegger. I think, too, it's almost like... I got this feeling a little bit in reading this book by Pope called Doing School, where I was like, well, I don't know. It was a very strange feeling of because things can be such a mixed bag. Like, for example, I'll just bring up, one of the questions that came to my mind. These kids who care about school, that seems, great, right? Because the kids who don't care about school, risk, getting into drugs or doing gang stuff or just kind of, doing kind of not so great stuff. Not necessarily, okay? But can. Maybe they go get a job and they're just fine. Right. But I'm like... There's a part of me that's like, oh, that's great that they care about school, but it's also like, is it good that they care about school?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. It's a mixed bag. Partly it's good, partly it's maybe not good because they're so stressed that their health is impacted. Yeah, right, exactly. Is it a good thing to care about politics? Because the thing is, it's like if there is this kind of, I don't know, this sort of well, it can be good, it can be bad. It does. There's it's. If I'm honest, there's kind of a temptation to just be like, well, why try to even do anything different? Why, well, okay, why try to even re-envision or reimagine? Like, you brought up imagination at the Real Talk today, and I thought that was really great. I just think that there's something about, obviously I feel like there's something important about reimagining and doing things, trying to do things differently, not for the sake of just being different, right? But just because you're really trying to think about the things you bring up. What is it? Sustainability.
Care, becoming.
Triplex. The triplex, right? That's really important. Triplex, because so it's like this weird space of recognizing that it's a mixed bag, and you can't really make some sort of hard claim, for example, with the public school system that it's always wrong or something. I mean, I went to public school,
sure.
But I think there's this kind of well, if you feel that, if that's true, then how could you even try to do something alternative? Why try to do something alternative? Isn't it just going to be a mixed bag over there? Maybe it would be worse. There's all those questions that come up that do kind of feel a little existential. I think, though, that's why there's this, you're talking about the groundlessness. I think that's where it goes back to that, where it's it does boil down to sort of a groundless choice of saying, well, that's right, that's true, and you're right, that maybe what I do that's different is worse. But I'm going to sort of go off of, what is the actual phenomenological things that I'm learning, and what are the actual kind of teleological things, or maybe the trajectory of these things, or the underpinnings of these things that you want to maybe re-examine and therefore do something different, or try to, or at least create a different type of cultivation or environment. And yeah, like I think that's why it's ultimately a risk. Yeah, you don't know if it will be better, but you'd still sort of go on and take that leap. Now it feels more challenging to do that when it impacts your children, or impacts your family, or those around you. But didn't like the founders of the country, or of the United States, like obviously there are people living in this land before that. But what I mean to say is, like, were they taking that risk that would impact their families too? So, and sometimes some of them were sought after and killed. So it's like there are real risks, and it's kind of terrifying. But it's also it feels like it's necessary as it relates to what I brought up with creative destruction. Because otherwise you don't really get invention. You don't get, you don't get any of that. And I think that's very, very necessary to, like, us being human even. So anyways, I hope that made sense. But there's this strange, deep kind of, it's a little unsettling, but it's also, like, I think it's a necessary thing you have to lean into.
Well, if you can't lean into it, then you're going to be captured. Like, if you can't face anxiety, freedom is anxiety. And so if you can't face it, then it's only a matter of time before you're captured by institutions, discourse, AI, it doesn't matter. Well, there's a weird thing. In the West, America, we've traditionally associated rationality with freedom, where, rationality will set you free.
Right.
Well, there's a very weird way in which if you need a rational reason to do something, you're not free because you're only doing it because it's rational. Yeah. So there's a bunch of things where one of the problems with the political discourse, and why I think we're really in trouble, well, we're having pathologies, if you will, is because we don't know what freedom is. Like, there are conservatives who are stressing kind of the freedom, freedom of an American. Then you have more liberal people stressing the freedom of the individual. But both of them, but in a weird way, you can't have freedom without annihilation. Like, groundlessness means you're free. Yeah. If you have a ground, there's a way in which you're not free. But at the same time, the freest thing is nothingness. Like, nothingness is free. Isn't that self-effacement? So we have some tensions here where if we really look at the concept of freedom, there's some ways in which the concept of freedom alone can't bear the weight, I think, of what our political discourse wants it to do. Like, freedom does not seem to be a prime value. We've made it a prime value, whether it be the freedom of the individual, the freedom to do what you want, the freedom of community, etc., so forth. But freedom seems to be a secondary thing. It seems to be a state of a choice. But there's a weird way in which choice and freedom are actually not the same. Like, you're free to choose, but that means you're free to choose your loss of freedom. Every choice is a loss of freedom. Like, if you choose to do X, you lose Y, right? So to be free to choose means you are free to determine your freedom, which means the freedom is limited. So you're free to limit. Free to choose means you're free to limit. And if freedom is only meaningful to the degree there's a choice, then freedom is meaningless without choice. And one of the reasons we have a meaning crisis is because we've stressed freedom without choice. But that would mean responsibility, right. And that would mean potential risk. And with responsibility, then we get the tension. So, generally there's this idea that, following some of the research, that more conservative-minded people are more fear-based. They tend to be hungry for security, where liberal people tend to be more open in different things. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think, though, is that in my experience, conservative people, they like build things. Oh, that's no way. They go into the wilderness. They're very brave. Like, they do manual labor. They're not afraid of things. But they are more anxious when it comes to questioning their beliefs. Mm-hmm. So there are different kinds of fear. So maybe the conservative, you can say, is a little more prone to an existential anxiety. But I wouldn't say they're, in my experience, often more liberal people are more afraid to go into the forest or see the wild elements, or
go to Trader Joe's.
Different things like that, right?
Go to the supermarket.
Exactly.
And I get it. Like, I'm not trying to hit on
Oh, sure. Whereas, conservatives are more able to just go out. So it's interesting. where liberals can be more okay with encountering diverse philosophical beliefs or different things like that. But one of the reasons might be is because conservatives are more likely to have a job or a commitment or a family or kids. So their worldview holds together all of these commitments and responsibilities they have. We're often just, in general, more liberal people may not have a family. They may not have kids, or they might have they hold beliefs loosely. Right?
Can that be a type of absolute choice?
It can be. Yeah, it can be. But the question is, what is this fear that is being described, right? And the more you're responsible for things, the more and more commitments you have, or the more you're communally involved, or you have kids, the more and more your defense of a worldview, or you want to say close the borders or whatever, is going to be tied to keeping that safe, right? Because
like you've got a family to protect, basically.
That's correct. And so the conservative fear of otherness can be based on wanting to protect their loved ones, not their own fear of death, but actually it's very interesting. I think sometimes what is seen as a fear of death of the individual is actually the fear of death of a loved one. Like more people, I think a lot of people are actually more afraid of a loved one dying than they are their own death, actually. And the issue is that letting the other party run the government could threaten their kids' future or threaten their community, and that's more of what they're afraid of than themselves, right? So whereas with more liberal people, if they're just gonna maybe leave America and go to Europe or travel a lot, or they're kind of more cosmopolitan, then actually what might be seen as a courage, or they're more open and therefore more courage, is actually a courage. It's more like just not having anything that you're afraid of losing, actually, or you're less committed to things. But that's not necessarily the same as courage, right? I actually think basically what we have is no courage on liberal or conservative side at all in an existential sense. There's a massive existential lack of courage. But existential courage would mean that you have absolute commitments that you're willing to expose to otherness. And that requires courage in a deep way.
Well, do you think that on the conservative side there's more courage in like the kind of real time, but there's less existential courage, but for the liberal it's reversed, like they have more existential courage?
I think that might be a way to frame it. They don't
have as much courage to like go out in the woods.
Yeah, and I guess what I was saying, you could say that what the liberal is doing is an absolute choice, in the sense that they are saying that the absolute nature of reality is one where that fluidity and lack of commitment is the best way to align with the absolute.
Right.
But it is, in a sense, practically very difficult to have an absolute choice if you're not going to take a stand on a given. And basically also too, what ends up happening is many liberals today, their absolute choice actually is neoliberal expressionism, identity, capital, without realizing it. They've actually fallen into a commodity.
Well, they have a given too. It's just kind of it's not a recognized one, and often it's a criticized one, even though it's one that basically operates their life.
Yes,
right?
Whereas the conservative given is very fragile. It's very fragile. Like the absolute choice that givens have, they're not very good at being open to otherness and acknowledging that other people can make other absolute choices and not be a bad person as a result. Right. So for example, a conservative is more likely to make an absolute choice that's going to align them with, say, a Christian worldview, but it will be very difficult for them to encounter an atheist and not believe that atheist needs to change their life, or there's something wrong with them, etc., so forth. Whereas the liberal person has a much easier time moving between the Hindu and the atheist and the Christian, but that can actually be because the only absolute choice they've made is the commodity form under capital or capitalism, right? Well, yeah, capitalism can fit with Hinduism, Christianity, atheism, and all these things. And then, of course, the liberal probably doesn't even realize they've, made that choice with the capital form, because they've been trained into it by the market system.
Just really quick, like a clarifying question. I already hinted at it, but is that a type of given?
Well, that's what belonging form? Into. Yeah, that's what we'll talk about. Is that ultimately there's a real way in which our problem today, when we talk about the loss of givens in part one, most of these are sociological. There's a way in which the problem is we haven't lost givens enough, because we still assume the commodity value form. Like, we've lost sociological givens, we've lost religious givens, but we actually, the value form of thinking about things as fungible or tradable according to capital is still actually a given that's there.
Right. And that's why I think there's kind of the crucible of, I want to say it's most likely to come through philosophy that undoes all of that, everything really. I mean, it undoes it so that you then have that, again, absolute choice, because you're going to have to live your life with with some givens, because, well, we use language. Are we not going to, that's a given, and we don't think it's some sort of like bad oppressive thing to use English or some language. So it's just that, it's really that kind of the crucible of deconstructing or allowing those to be kind of exposed or understood, or like, oh wow, I never realized I had that type of a given on the commodity form or whatever it is. So that you can then become, like, I want to say, more aware and more informed and more have your own volition in that choice.
And I should say a few things, like a few points, is that if someone does not consciously make an absolute choice, aware that they're facing the groundlessness of being, and yet nevertheless choosing something as absolute for them, like hanging a law over their neck, there's a way in which they're not technically making an absolute choice.
Right, and I think that's an important point too, where I think there are many people who maybe haven't yet, and that's...
I think the majority. I think by far the majority have not made an absolute choice. I think they've, in a sense, absorbed an absolute orientation without realizing it.
Sure.
And the other thing I would say is I still think it's fair to say that we've lost givens today, because most people do think that capitalism could be given, that capitalism is not given. Here's the rub. This is where I think it's very important to understand the beginning of Capital by Marx. We realize that capitalism is not given, that you could have a different structure. The issue, though, is that what we don't understand is, in that realization of the loss of givens, we are still structured in terms of social horizon and imagination by the commodity value form. So this is where we're in a really weird place, where nothing is given, but we're not able to imagine beyond that loss of givens. And this, I think, is going back to the main point. In the loss of givens, where you realize the groundlessness of everything, imagination is huge. Because we were saying that freedom cannot be a primary thing, because it's too ambiguous, it's too unclear, right? So what you need is something else. Now, ultimately, it's beauty. So everyone sign up for Thomas Jockin's course at Halcon Guild. Jockin is, I can't imagine a better teacher on the topic of beauty. But so to cut to the chase, ultimately you need beauty as a value form, not merely capital. But imagination, which is non-rational, and is the work of the child subject of Nietzsche, there's a lot there, is precisely what you need in freedom. When faced with nothingness, how do you fill nothingness with something? Imagination. You need to be able to create. You need to imagine something. And if it is beautiful to you, then it has an authority even if it's groundless. This is the trick. Beauty creates an authority even though it's groundless. Because it attracts you.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say real quick, I mean...
So if the value form is still limiting imagination, then we have the worst of all possible situations. We have no givens, so we're like, the terror of freedom is upon us, but we have no imagination by which to deal with groundlessness, so...
And underneath that all is a secret tucked in there given
of the value form. Yes.
So
the commodity value form.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about what we were talking about a little bit, where you're talking about this idea of, where the conservative mind may be more inclined toward that, what was it, amygdala, like that part of the brain.
Yeah, the fear base.
Flight or flight, and, sort of that mode of, like, very, what's it called, imminent danger, right? And how to protect.
Not to interrupt,
okay.
I think one of the keys is a lot of that fear. I don't think we pay enough attention to a fear that can emerge from a fear of doing something immoral. Like, where the conservative can feel that fear is because I'm talking with the atheists and not mentioning Jesus, and they're afraid they're doing something wrong.
Right.
That fear I don't think is appreciated enough. I think a lot of those studies that show conservative fear is not like a literal fear of death, but it's actually a fear of immorality, doing something wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's why it's quite nuanced, right? Because like there's that fear isn't just of bears and
Yes.
It's like it's a type of fear that has to do with like the things you hold most, because for the conservative, their faith is like their bread and butter, like it's their breath, right? Like it's everything that they do and think and practice, right? So it's very close, it's like anyways, so yeah. But I think with the because the I'm going to forget the term, but the part of the brain that is associated more with the liberal, we all have these parts of the brain, by the way, but like that being more developed or more having more activity or something, like there's something about that where it has something to it has more to do with that abstract thought, right? But that's where you get the fear of not getting into college, right? So you get lots of fears there as well. They just look different, and that's why I think you have maybe more people having social anxiety and all these things where it's like we talked about this in terms of rural and city. Like I think that's a helpful thing to understand, because that gives a better kind of context for maybe where these things come from and why. Like conservative and liberal can kind of feel like these floating terms that are very loaded, like Denver was talking about, with like these things that maybe they don't even know like what actual policy, but there's like these kind of the aesthetic of what those things are, or the general category, right? But when you get into like how do people actually live, how does the rural person live, how does the city person live, right? I just think it's funny because the rural person, they might just like for them it's just kind of interesting to think about. I don't know why I keep thinking of this example. I think it's just because it sometimes comes up a lot on social media, where this idea of social anxiety, or like being nervous to go, go in public or whatever. But for the rural person, they would almost find that like, what do you mean? You just don't go, right? Like you either just don't go, or you don't go and you don't care, right? Because why? Like there's nothing threatening you about just other people.
Right.
Like, but it's weird because it's so from both camps, they see each other as doing the very thing that they think the other person's doing, right? Because it's like, but you won't even let anyone in who's not like looks just like you, right? Like, and they're like, no, that then they would kind of, there'd be a argument over it or something like this. But there's a I think why I'm saying all of this is just to say the nuance of fear is important, because then I think we can also become more. Again, I don't want to boil it down to this, and this was mentioned in the real talk, but when you understand that, there's a kind of, like there's a way in which both perspectives or both sides, they actually maybe are, not like each other in many ways, but also have things that are similar in terms of the fact that it's, how do I put this? There's a humanness of fears that drive people that can either manifest in kind of like we're saying a little bit more on the conservative side of you just deal with it, right? Or the anxiety, right? And I do think that generally speaking, there seems to be, on the whole, not necessarily, and this might be different because internet can seep into rural areas and all that, but there's more anxiety on the liberal side, can be.
Well, I mean, there's all these, it's hard with these studies because then it turns out 5 years later they can't be replicated. But, you have these studies that show the most unhappy people are apparently liberal females, right? Yeah. And the happiest people, or the most, are conservative men. Well, that doesn't seem to line up with conservatives being afraid, unless, like you're saying, conservatives are more fearful while liberals are more anxious. Maybe that's a way to frame it. But
we can't see. I've brought this up just from like a personal perspective, where it's hard for me to not conflate fear and anxiety, because just given my own background and kind of mixture, of things, it's like I went to a very liberal high school. I was in that kind of context all the time, and definitely driven by wanting high grade point average, and not because my parents pressured me, but I pressured myself. Sure. I pressured myself. The school made me not like the school did either, but the social horizon, right? The us, this kind of collective, it just made me feel like that. Like, and why wouldn't I want to do my best? Like, and be my best if I could, I should do it. And so, again, admirable in some way, but also kind of a little bit foolish. Like, I fortunately had things to remind me that, like, hey, like, life is more than just your grades. But for maybe if you don't have that perspective, it's crazy because it can really be very pigeonholed in what it's focusing on. But the point of the matter is, fear and anxiety are different. They are different, and they feel different. They have these different forms or manifestations, and so, but it's very hard to parse those things. Yeah, and to tell the difference. And it's very difficult to look at another person and know if they're feeling, assessing a type of genuine, legitimate fear or concern, or if they're being anxious. And I think, for generally speaking, we do have, just because of the news and what runs most of big cities that are like get the heavily densely populated areas, that is the anxiety.
It seems
so. Then it just kind of feels like, well, if the conservatives afraid, they're just like an anxious wreck, right? And no wonder they don't want anyone letting into the country anyways. Which, again, I mean, there's obviously for critiques of that perspective. I'm just saying that it's. I think there's something quite freeing, though, when you understand that there is a difference experientially in fear versus anxiety, but it's not easy to navigate that.
Not at all.
And I think too, just one more thing, I do think it's interesting that generally speaking, you have to, it's kind of like, I don't know, it is just sort of trade-offs, like which is kind of making a person able to function in the world in the best way possible. Now, maybe that sounds too utilitarian or something, but I'm just saying, like, I don't know, I read something one time about, like, people back in the day, you don't want to over-idealize these things, but just working with your hands, having these kind of, like, you had more reliance on if it rained and all this stuff, and there's definite stress, like, potential stressors, but it almost feels like it's different, because it's not this looming thing of, like, your future,
Right.
You don't even know, you accept already you don't know if you have a future, you don't know if you're going to live the next day, kind of thing, and you sort of accept that really radically, so then you kind of just live more just dealing with what you have going on, which does in a way feel less of the anxiety stress. It feels more like, it might be tough, but it's also like freeing in a way.
I mean, if you lose the amygdala, you die. Like, fear and survival are tied together. This is what's weird. So there's a few things. It is questionable if anxiety helps you survive. It is imaginable that fear helps you survive. In fact, animals that don't fear things die. Because because it seems as if in fear there's the possibility of wisdom, where in anxiety there's not. Maybe.
Well, anxiety is such a torment. It's so, like, the word I think of when I think of anxiety is like torment, which I know is a strong word. I know it's a strong word.
Well, there's a weird way in which fear it's almost like fear is unstable, where it can move into wisdom because it moves into action to do what you need to do, or it falls back into anxiety. Maybe there's something there with that, where...
Yeah, and they definitely like are in a constant, I want to say, a little bit of a movement.
Well,
there.
because the thing is, what's called fear may just be awareness of consequences to not do X, but if you're just confident you're going to do X, then the fear is just the awareness of doing X, right? It's not really an anxiety thing. It's a kind of wisdom. So there's a weird dynamic here where fear that moves into wisdom, it's as if it was never even fear. Whereas fear that moves into anxiety falls back. I almost want to use this language of move into wisdom versus fall back into anxiety. Maybe there's something where if fear falls back into anxiety, it's as if it was always anxiety, right? Like there's this trace that's covered up in a way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look, what you were saying in the past, it's very well documented, and Cadell was mentioning this in the Hegel lectures. Suicide rates, Durkheim, Viva, they're through the roof, right? I mean, mental health, like these things, suicide goes up in first world nations. Anxiety, psychoanalysis goes up in first world nations. Freud understood that psychoanalysis was needed not for third world nations, but first world nations. Right. So a new emotional state emerges in modernity that is classically doesn't exist. And I think it's fair to associate it with anxiety and existentialism, right?
Yeah.
So that's very interesting, though, because you would think in all the religious wars or, all the wars of human history, you would have had anxiety. But, I mean, I think you could argue, there was lots of violence, lots of horror in human history, and yet anxiety seems new. And so what creates the conditions of anxiety? It seems to be tied to abstraction.
Well, that would be interesting. You talk about that book on boredom.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
like
yes.
how boredom wasn't really a term until a certain time.
No.
I wonder what that...
Anxiety and boredom are tied together with the Great Enrichment in the beginning of the 18th century.
Well,
absolutely.
I would be interested to understand, like, its etymological history, because you said, like, it seems new, right? Anxiety seems new.
Yeah, Durkheim's suicide book. Boredom.
No, I think that
existentialism doesn't really emerge until the 19th century, right?
Yeah, but then you have like this. Isn't there that, like, I think Lacan, or it's a psychoanalyst, said something like anxiety is the only thing you can trust, or something like that.
Yeah.
So, like, that's interesting. It doesn't have any, like, historical roots to kind of substantiate that sort of claim. I'm not saying the claim's wrong. I'm just saying that if it's new, I'm not saying you shouldn't trust it or something like that. I'm just saying, like, what gives it such a strong kind of...
Well, there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek. There's it's kind of the idea if you can't cross the Kantian noumenon, but you feel anxious, well, that's got to be kind of the birth of the absolute. Because the anxiety... the reason why is because anxiety is talking about nothingness. And the lack is absolute.
Right, and I kind of, we talked about that just a little bit earlier, where that unsettling feeling, and you need to be able to press into that. And that's the thing. It's kind of like when Kierkegaard talks about being anxious in the right way. It's not like you're just trying to avoid any type of, like, unsettling feeling. Yes. That's what it means to be human, truly, if you are going to be responsible for anything, to have that feeling, right? But I do think there's a difference between that and, like, the consuming, like I said, the word torment, that tormenting, consuming nature of anxiety, that just, basically just, it's like, there's something about it that just is all consuming. Like, it's not something you come in and out of it, I suppose, but it's like, it's different. It's different than just the having to kind of do that leap, like you're jumping out the plane, and then, it's scary, but then you hit, like, the free fall, and you don't even, you kind of feel like there's a groundlessness or something like that.
Well, so there's a few things. So there's a way, if it is the case that groundlessness is actually the possibility of a kind of freedom that makes you able to interact with government special interest groups in a way where you don't get over-invested with them. That ability to say nothing matters. Nothing matters, therefore it matters that I'm here, but also nothing matters, so soft power can only have so much control over me.
Right.
That can only be earned by facing anxiety. Yeah. So anxiety, and Cadell and I were talking about this at Parallax, in a way, the liberal, by being more prone to anxiety, is better positioned for the superpower of nothing matters than the conservative.
Yeah.
But, so there's a way in which the conservative, the problem for the conservative is that fear isn't anxiety, actually. That they can actually become, to use Lacanian language, they're more prone to the neurotic, to the power authority structure, precisely because they learn to use fear as a defense of the neurotic. Whereas, and Teton was talking about this, and Cadell as well, the liberal can fall into the psychotic, which is to say they just feel at home everywhere, because they're so full, and Ebert will talk about this. But here's the problem. The liberal can obtain that by saying nothing matters. Not in the sense of a given absolute choice is what I'm going to defend, while defending that absolute choice with nothing matters. That means it's groundless, and yet I'm still going to commit to it. Yep. The liberal can do it through a radical relativism. So they're more psychotic. But what we're talking about is the psychotic returning, Cadell and I talked about returning to the father. The psychotic choosing the neurotic. The psychotic chooses the neurotic. And that would be the absolute choice. And that's a psychological configuration that seems necessary for belonging again in a manner that is not naive. Yeah. So, fear and anxiety are not the same. The conservative seem more fear-based actually makes them more neurotic, tempted, but they have the neurotic, which they need. That's part of this return we described. Return to the father with the RE in parentheses, kind of return to common life in a way. Prodigal son kind of story. The liberal can be psychotic precisely because they're like, well, everyone's different, it's cool. And they're kind of like, everywhere they go, I was talking about the difference with Teton at the last net, where the neurotic is kind of the image, cell phone. This is the authority. and they just keep their eyes on the cell phone and they never look around. They just keep their eyes down on the image. Whereas the psychotic, the more liberal person, works by putting on headphones and just listening to music. And everywhere they go, no matter what they see, they're at home because they got the music on. But they do that by what? Not really listening to the real difference out there. They're just listening to headphones. So they're full with the music, so they're at home anywhere, right? But they're at home anywhere because they haven't made a commitment. They haven't really listened to what's there, right? So what's required is a psychotic form, a psychological subject, a form that goes through anxiety to choose a given, to choose a given that thus functions as a gift, that they can give to the world, that's kind of earned through the nothing matters. That seems to be the kind of subject that would be able to do politics differently today, because otherwise you're just going to be overwhelmed by the objective fictions. All of the objective fictions will always eventually control you because you don't have the superpower of being able to say, well, nothing matters, thus dissolving the power, and yet still in the midst of all of that being committed to a certain vision of a beauty that you are seeking, that you are defending yourself with annihilation so that the objective fictions and soft powers don't control you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think too, I think that maybe there's this kind of, thinking about the concern of the conservative, right, who's kind of in their mind controlled by fear. Like, there is something about, I think maybe it's like, well, just because you're afraid doesn't mean I have to be. Like, sure. I'm gonna go. I'm not gonna necessarily and I think there's just, I think it's kind of having to really, just to have kind of a respect for, in a sense, the fact that both exist, of course, but also that a lot of times the people who kind of, I want to say, hold down a fort of some sort. I don't mean that in like a militaristic sense. I just mean a home or a place that is built or made or whatever. People have to run that, and so and take care of it. So and I mean, that's the beautiful dialectic of like being able to be a traveler, but also have actual places to travel to. That's not just being in the middle of a Amazonian jungle, I mean, that could be cool too. But, and I'm not saying there aren't people there who could help guide you and provide shelter or something like that and food. But, it's just always kind of keeping that in perspective, because, it can see it. We have to be careful before we kind of decry the thing. And sure, I'm not trying to, I think there are obviously, pros and cons and some pitfalls on both sides of the spectrum, but also beneficial things to learn from both sides of the spectrum if we want to think about it as that, in that way. But we don't want to, decry something that we really ultimately need, even though it might be needed in a different way, but that is home.
Well, I mean, to that, it's like the example, but it's the difference between a renter and a homeowner. Like, I don't think it's by chance that a lot of liberals rent. Now, we should note that a lot of people are renting because of asset prices, homes being so expensive, so I'm not bashing renting. But if you're renting, then the guy who owns the property is taking care of things. That changes everything. Like, if you own something, or you own a business, or you own a property, or that you have to tend to, then you not being there might mean that's, something very problematic occurs, and you're not there, and then, you lose $30,000 or something, right? So, but that dynamic that you're describing is what emerges with absolute choice. Like, serious absolute choice is a movement into what Illich calls dwelling. Like, you're going to have to dwell. Well, that means you're going to limit. This is why, in a way, choice and freedom are kind of opposites. Like, a choice is a limitation and a commitment, which then, everyone can be like, oh, you're wasting opportunity, you're wasting potential. Yeah, well, if no one committed to anything, there would be no potentials to realize, right? But basically, this is where everyone has to stop moralizing. Everyone has to stop judging. Everyone is limited or, whatever, right? Because there's a dynamic here. I mean, in a way, it's this weird dynamic tension between freedom and choice that we don't actually fully appreciate. And if we're going to do politics right, we have to think about choice being the limitation of freedom that is possible because people have limited their freedom in ways to provide things that can be chosen.
Right.
And that that's the blood and sweat of our lives, right? That's the work of our lives. And it has to be, and you see, here's the rub. If the point of politics is to increase freedom, then there's almost always going to be a kind of tiered system between the people who made choices to make there be things to choose and the free. Because, like, the people who made choices are like, well, politics isn't for me then because it's all about freedom. And that means it's ultimately empty, because the moment a choice is made, freedom is limited. So you get this really pathological structure that is probably going to just form resentment and discouragement. Because to the people who have made a choice and thus limited themselves, a politics of freedom in a way is kind of mocking them because it's reminding them they're not free. And then the people that the politics is setting free can never make a choice. And so that freedom has to be, well, then they're just going to be anxious. Politics can only increase anxiety then, because freedom is anxiety. Like, that's the weird thing. Anxiety, the reason why anxiety develops a lot in the 20th century is because people are what? Set free. They're set free from their common life and religions or traditions. Science, frees them to feel like they have freedom over nature. Anxiety, in a way, is the feeling of freedom. And it turns out that the feeling of freedom makes us bored and commit suicide and gives us mental illness. Freedom gives you mental illness. Mm-hmm. And so, if politics sets you free, of which you lose if you choose, so then you should never make a choice so that you have political power, politics then creates mental illness. And this is not a sustainable political project. And so you have to instead, in a way, I guess you could say the thing that politics today is not speaking about that is causing all the problem is that its main values are not sustainable. That its main values are actually a self-effacing contradiction, not a contradiction that leads to a sublation, because that would mean a politics of beauty, ultimately. Again, sign up for Jockin's course.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yes, absolutely. Sign up for Jockin's course. And I wanted to say, though, you said freedom leads to mental illnesses, right?
Yes.
Well, I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. But what
if it doesn't transfer to choice,
right? Well, right.
And why would you make a choice? Because you lose your freedom. So it's not that this is a crazy land.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about, like, I think of mental illness and freedom as, like, I guess what I'm thinking about this on a phenomenological level. So I know we're talking more like ontological freedom, which then is,
well, freedom is freedom from mental illness, right? And yet freedom, like, if you have a mental illness, you're not free.
No,
right?
You're not free.
But this is the problem.
Yeah.
Freedom creates the mental illness that makes you not feel free, which then you seek to get. You see how it's a mess.
But the thing is, I don't think, like, choice doesn't preclude. It doesn't, like, exclude freedom. It incorporates freedom.
Well, choice is the sublation of freedom. It
limits freedom.
Yes.
But then it still affords freedom, a type of freedom.
But this is the problem. Like,
and maybe that
freedom is too ambiguous. Like, it can't be a prime value because there's freedom to, there's freedom from,
freedom in,
and
freedom.
Like Isaiah Berlin. But the key freedom we talk about is freedom with, or freedom in.
Yeah.
That requires beauty.
Right.
The only way to get freedom with or in is in a thing that you trust or that feels graceful, and that would ultimately have to be something you experience as beautiful, because that beauty can be groundless and yet feel authoritative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it all has to come to some sort of movement of the subject toward beauty, which then, if there's something about lack, that actually is an apathetic opening or river hole, as Cadell talks about in Systems of Subjects, that is precisely the way to ontologically think that makes us open to beauty, then we see that lack is the social horizon, the value form, the subjective habituation, incubator, of which makes us toward beauty. Mm-hmm. And then politics becomes about what does it mean to create the infrastructure or social organization by which beauty might be possible. And then beauty, of course, then does what? Creates intrinsic motivation, because when you see something beautiful, you want more of it. So beauty then becomes this orbiting principle.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and I'm really glad we could have this conversation because, again, like I started saying, I think there's a strange kind of ambivalent relationship with politics, but I think it's really an important thing to understand how to engage with and what perspective to perhaps consider regarding politics and the political system at large. So, and how it relates to belonging again. So, Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and then again, as we'll get in at the Parallax course, then the questions is, what is the infrastructural, economic, educational transformations by which to incubate people as subjects of beauty in this way? Well, look, I mean, there's this real tension. I'm glad, the stuff you were saying on ambiguity is so important, because in one way, it seems good to not focus on the political and just focus on your community, right? But in your family, and you're, not worry about it. But in another way, that runs the risk of the private faith that Matthew Stanley is warning about with Rodriguez, and that Zizek is warning about with Western Buddhism. So there's a real problem there, because there seems to be a ditch on either side of the road. We talk in the grand technology about, how you see bad things happening in the world, and, if you care about them, though, that's what the capital nation state wants you paralyzed by all the bad things happening, so you don't do anything. And so then you need to focus more on the immediate, the quotidian, but then there's a risk of a certain private faith in that, like a private experience that excludes you from political involvement. This is a massive tension. That is why Belonging Again really stresses this focus on development of the subject that has universal ramifications without losing the development of the subject in the process. But this is where I just think we have to think. We just have to think of a lot of things we don't usually think about in regard to forming culture in society. We think a lot about a lot of stuff that is not the way, and we have to think more about aesthetics and culture and incubating in medium conditions and stuff like that. Because if we don't, we're just going to fall on either trying to change the world and losing the capacity to raise a family, or we're going to raise a family as a way to shield ourselves from the world. It's that great line in Dostoevsky where he says, "Father, I sinned. I came to love humanity and lost the ability to love an individual." So that's a problem. But then there's the individual doesn't worry about humanity, and that seems to be a problem. And I think the political question helps bring out these tensions that Belonging Again will focus on. So if everyone would, everyone, thank you for being here. And if everyone would sign up for the course, we'd appreciate it.
That's right. There's offline and online options. So check it out at Parallax. They have on their website, you can learn more about our course starting July 7th. And we're really grateful to be at Parallax again.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for listening and for your time.
And for more, please visit ogrose.com. You can go to Amazon to pick up a copy of the book. All purchases and reviews are extremely appreciated. And you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Anchor, YouTube, and so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.